Okay, so now there's a shock here because essentially, in some sense, the entity that's going to provide the solution to this very complex problem has arrived on the scene. But it's quite damaged. First of all, it's been speaking improperly, right? So that's an adolescent representation. So it brays a lot of nonsense. And it's been corrupted in a variety of ways. And so, you know, to some degree what that means is that as you mature and you're moving away from your mere marionette status, your interaction with society, like Rousseau said, corrupts you in all sorts of ways. I mean, you're participating in that corruption, but it still happens. But in the representation in the movie, the truth of the matter is it doesn't matter if you've been corrupted to some degree, as long as you haven't absolutely sacrificed your capacity for true speech and vision. So, you know, that's a pretty hopeful message, because Pinocchio is by no means a perfect entity, but he might be good enough. See, that's also an indication there of why people are often unwilling to form a representation with, so to speak, form a relationship with the archetype of the Great Father, because to some degree the archetype is a figure of perfection, and the individual in relationship to that archetype is always pathologically flawed. And so the embarrassment of that realization, which is exactly what's happening to Pinocchio right now, is often enough to stop people from doing it. So what that would say, what that means in some sense, is that in order for you to mature in the fullest possible manner, you have to understand the manner in which you're deeply flawed in relationship to your potential as it might be historically determined. And that's a very bitter thing to do. You know, it's much easier, and people do this all the time, to engage in half-witted, formulaic, ideological criticisms of the system as a whole. It's like, you know, the probability that the system is more flawed than you is pretty damn low. So you might want to start with, you know, getting rid of your donkey ears and your tail and stop braying nonsense before you judge the entire, you know, historical process by which human beings have come into being. So anyways, that's kind of what that means. Okay, so this is very interesting too, because so Pinocchio ends up being a master of fire. Well, you can think about that as, there is a book written a while back by a primatologist who also wrote Demonic Males, Richard Wrangham. And he talked about the origin of fire. And as far as Wrangham is concerned, we invented fire about 2 million years ago. And that enabled us to cook food. And that enabled us to swap intestinal length for brain. So if you look at a chimpanzee, you know, chimpanzees are like the ultimate in couch potatoes, right? They're about this high and they're shaped like this. They have this huge barrel body. And the reason they have that is because they eat leaves. And so they have to spend like 8 hours a day eating leaves. They will eat meat if they can get it. They have to spend like 8 hours a day eating leaves and just chewing them over and over, because like leaves, A, they don't want to be eaten, so they're pretty tough and inedible, and B, they don't have any nutritive quality to speak of. So the chimpanzee has to spend all of its time chewing, which is a rather mindless endeavor, all things considered. Whereas human beings, 2 million years ago or thereabouts, invented fire, and as a consequence of that, we could cook meat. And meat is incredibly energy rich. And it's easy to digest once it's cooked. And so the consequence of the invention of fire was that we're the way we are today. We could have a brain instead of a gut. And so the idea that Pinocchio's mastery of fire, and it's as something more than merely a means of cooking. That's how it started out, right? But you can think of our entire technological capacity as stemming from the mastery of fire. Now, the other thing you can think of, and this is very much worth considering, is that Pinocchio masters fire, and that turns the whale into a dragon. And so the idea there, too, is that, and this is an old idea, is that our technological prowess is something that makes nature itself angry. And, of course, you might say, well, do you believe this? And the answer to that is, well, how many of you have environmentalist leanings? And that's exactly the story that you're following, because you're still wondering about whether or not mastery of fire was in somehow against the natural order, and that it will end up in all of our deaths. And you know, that's a reasonable thing to worry about, but not mastering it was going to end up pretty badly too. So here what happens is that in the midst of this complete chaos, Pinocchio has a choice, and the choice is he can either save himself, which is a very, very selfish choice and reduces him to an ahistorical individual because he has no relationship left with his father, or he can put himself at great risk and rescue his father, finish the process, stop his father from drowning, and complete the story. Okay, so Pinocchio dies, and then his father brings him home. And so because he's rescued his father, the benevolent spirit of nature appears, resurrects him, and turns him into a real human being. So it's pretty funny, as far as I'm concerned, that the answer to Nietzsche's great question manifested itself in mid-1930s in the form of an animated child's movie. So, and that's an example. That's an example of a number of things. It's an example of how archetypes work. It's also an example of how artists are on the edge of discovery all the time. And they discover things they don't even understand. So, we'll see you next Tuesday.